There are moments in history, or perhaps moments hidden somewhere between history and faith, when one decision changes everything. Not a king starting a war, not an empire rising to power, not a great army conquering nations, just one person, making one impossible choice. And perhaps that is where this story begins, with a man who walked away from certainty, away from comfort, away from everything he had ever known. His name was Abraham, or at least that is the name history remembers. But before he became Abraham, before millions called him the father of faith, before entire civilizations traced their identity back to him, he was simply a man named Abram, an ordinary man, living an ordinary life, in an ordinary city. And perhaps that is exactly what makes this story extraordinary. Because history rarely changes through ordinary people who stay comfortable. History changes when someone risks everything. Imagine his world for a moment. A thriving city, markets alive with voices, families living close together, traditions passed from generation to generation, a home filled with familiarity, everything predictable, everything safe, a future already written, the kind of life many people spend their whole existence trying to build. Security, routine, belonging. And then, one day, everything changed. No warning, no explanation anyone else could understand. Only a voice, a calling, a command so unreasonable, most people would have ignored it immediately. The ancient story says God spoke to Abram, and what came next sounded impossible. Leave. Leave your country. Leave your family. Leave your father's house. Leave the world you know, and go to a place that has not even been shown to you yet. Think about that. No destination. No map. No certainty. No proof. Only trust. Only mystery. Only a promise. Imagine hearing those words. What would you do? Would you leave everything behind for something invisible? Would you risk certainty for hope? Would you walk away from safety toward something you cannot even explain? Most people would not. Most people stay where life feels familiar. Most people choose comfort, predictability, control, because uncertainty terrifies human beings. And honestly, who could blame them? Leaving means risking failure, risking loneliness, risking regret, risking becoming the fool everyone talks about. And perhaps that happened to Abram too. Imagine the conversations. Neighbors whispering, friends confused, family questioning him. You are leaving. For where? And perhaps Abram answered, I do not know. Imagine the silence after that, the confusion, the disbelief. You are leaving everything behind for a destination you cannot even name. It sounds irrational, dangerous, impossible. And yet, something inside Abram moved, something stronger than fear, something stronger than comfort, faith, or perhaps something even deeper, purpose. Because every once in a while, human beings feel something difficult to explain, a pull, a calling, a feeling that life is meant for something more, even when logic says stay, even when fear says stop, even when nobody else understands. And maybe that is why Abraham's story still matters, because deep down, many people understand what it feels like to stand at the edge of uncertainty. To wonder, should I stay where life feels safe, or risk everything for meaning? A career, a relationship, a dream, a new beginning, a painful ending, a leap into uncertainty. Every human being eventually faces moments like this. Moments when life quietly asks, will you remain where you are, or become who you are meant to be? And perhaps that is what makes Abraham different. He walked Not because certainty existed, but despite uncertainty. The ancient story says he left, packed everything, family, livestock, possessions, and began walking toward a future he could not see. No guarantees, no proof, only belief. And if we are honest, that sounds terrifying, because people often romanticize faith. But real faith is frightening. Faith means moving before answers arrive, trusting before evidence appears, walking while still uncertain, and maybe that is why Abraham still fascinates history. Because somehow, one man's decision changed the course of civilization. 3 major world religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all trace themselves back to him. Millions call him father. Billions know his story. And it all began with one impossible decision: to leave. But here is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because historians still argue, did Abraham really exist? Was he a real man? A tribal leader remembered through memory? A symbolic figure? A sacred myth? Something in between? And even more importantly, why would anyone abandon everything for a promise no one else could see? Was this courage, faith, madness, or perhaps the beginning of one of the most important journeys in human history? Because before Abraham became the father of nations, he was simply a man standing at a crossroads, a man forced to choose between certainty and calling. And perhaps that same choice still waits for every human being. So, before we decide who Abraham truly was, before we judge his decision, we must first return to the world he came from. A dangerous world, a complicated world, a world filled with gods, power, uncertainty, and survival. Because to understand the man who walked away from everything, we must first understand what he was leaving behind. Before we can understand Abraham, before we can understand why a man would leave everything behind, we must first understand the world he came from. Because no story exists in isolation. Every choice is shaped by its environment. Every act of courage is born from context. And Abraham's world was far more dangerous than many people imagine. When most people think about biblical history, they picture deserts, camels, nomadic tribes wandering endlessly beneath an empty sky. But Abraham's world was not empty. Far from it. It was alive, complicated, ambitious, and in many ways, surprisingly advanced. According to the biblical account, Abraham, originally called Abram, came from a city called Ur, a place historians associate with one of the great urban centers of ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the mighty rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, a region historians often call the cradle of civilization. This matters because Abraham was not born into wilderness. He was born into civilization. Imagine standing there thousands of years ago, bustling streets filled with merchants, trade routes stretching farther than most people could travel in a lifetime, homes built close together, markets filled with noise, farmers bringing crops, craftsmen shaping tools, families raising children beneath the shadow of towering temples. Ur was wealthy, organized, powerful. People traded metals, textiles, food, jewelry, ideas. This was not primitive humanity struggling to survive. This was early civilization learning power. And perhaps that is what made Abraham's decision feel so impossible. Because leaving Ur did not mean escaping poverty. It meant abandoning comfort. Imagine modern life for a moment. A stable home, predictable routines, community, security. Then imagine someone asking you to leave all of it, without telling you where you are going. That was Abraham's reality. But comfort came with danger too. Because ancient Mesopotamia was beautiful. and brutal. Kings fought constantly. Empires rose and collapsed. Trade routes brought wealth, but also invasion. Violence was common. Life was uncertain. A city thriving today could disappear tomorrow. Power shifted constantly. Fear lived close to everyday life. And perhaps that instability shaped how people understood the world, because ancient people did not separate survival from religion. Religion was survival. Everything felt sacred. Rain, harvests, fertility, war, disease, flooding. People believed gods controlled life itself. The ancient world overflowed with gods. Gods for storms, gods for rivers, gods for the moon, gods for war, gods for fertility, gods for crops. Every city had its own deities. Every family trusted traditions passed down through generations. And in Abraham's city, one god stood above many others. The moon god, worshipped with enormous devotion. Temples rose high above the city. Priests held influence. Religion shaped daily life. Identity, community, power. Now think about what that means. If Abraham truly received a divine calling, then leaving was not merely geographical. Leaving meant spiritual separation, cultural separation, identity separation. He was not simply moving houses. He was walking away from the entire worldview of his civilization. Imagine how shocking that must have looked. A man abandoning his homeland, leaving family traditions, walking away from familiar gods, following a voice no one else could hear. To many around him, that may have looked irrational, even dangerous, because ancient societies valued stability. Family mattered, community mattered, your people mattered. Leaving meant vulnerability, isolation, risk. In many ancient cultures, identity came from land and bloodline. You belonged somewhere. You stayed where your ancestors stayed. You worshipped what your family worshipped. You protected your tribe. You survived together. But Abraham's story breaks that pattern completely. Because suddenly, a man chooses uncertainty over security, a future he cannot see, over the life he already knows. And perhaps that is why his story still feels radical, even today. Because human beings crave certainty. We like plans, maps, guarantees. We want evidence before action, safety before movement. But Abraham's journey begins with something terrifying. No guarantees. The biblical story says God promised Abraham something extraordinary. A future, a land, a people, a blessing. Yet there was one enormous problem. Abraham had no child, no heir, no visible future. Think about that. In the ancient world, children meant survival, legacy, protection. Without descendants, your name disappeared. Your family line ended. Your memory faded. And Abraham, he was already growing older. Years passing, hope shrinking. Imagine the emotional weight of that, a promise of descendants, while childlessness quietly followed him. Promise of nations, while reality suggested the opposite. And suddenly, Abraham's story becomes deeply human. Because who among us has never wrestled with delayed hope? Who among us has never believed in something, while circumstances seem to argue against it? Perhaps that is why Abraham still resonates. Because his story is not merely historical. It is psychological. The tension between fear and trust, between comfort and calling, between visible reality and invisible possibility. But history complicates things further, because historians still debate Abraham himself. Did he truly exist? Was he a real person? Or a symbolic ancestor created over time? The truth is, evidence remains difficult. There are no inscriptions saying, Abraham lived here. No confirmed archaeological proof. No tomb. No surviving document, ending debate forever. And yet, something interesting remains. Many details in Abraham's story feel culturally authentic to the ancient Near East. Nomadic migration, family structures, legal customs, tribal agreements, patterns of movement. Many scholars argue the narrative reflects a believable ancient setting. Perhaps memory survived. Perhaps oral tradition preserved fragments of a real person. Perhaps Abraham existed, but history blurred around him. Or perhaps he became larger than history, because some people become symbols, and Abraham became symbol and ancestor simultaneously. The man who trusted uncertainty, the man who left safety, the man who believed before proof arrived. Still, before we romanticize Abraham too much, we should remember something difficult. The ancient world was terrifying. Travel itself was dangerous. Bandits, famine, war, disease, harsh landscapes, death always nearby. Leaving home meant risking everything. You could lose family, livestock, protection, community, your future itself. There was no GPS, no secure roads, no certainty of arrival. Every journey required courage, and Abraham's journey, it demanded extraordinary courage, or extraordinary faith, perhaps both. Imagine the night before departure, the city quiet, familiar sounds echoing through the streets, people sleeping, routine continuing, and Abraham standing somewhere in silence, looking toward a future he cannot see, wondering, questioning, fear rising, hope rising too, asking himself, what if I am wrong? Because courage does not mean fear disappears. Courage means moving despite fear. And perhaps that is the forgotten truth of Abraham's story. He was not fearless. He was willing to leave certainty, willing to trust mystery, willing to walk before understanding. And honestly, that feels uncomfortable in a world obsessed with certainty. Because modern people often wait until every answer appears. Every detail explained, every risk reduced. But history repeatedly reminds us the biggest changes in life rarely come with guarantees. Sometimes, the future asks us to move before certainty arrives. And, maybe, that is why Abraham still matters. Because before he became the father of nations, before promises, before blessing, before legacy, he was simply a man living in a dangerous world, asked to trust something he could not yet see. And somewhere, inside one of history's greatest civilizations, a journey quietly began. A journey that would eventually reshape religion, identity, and perhaps human history itself. There are moments in life when everything changes quietly. No thunder, no crowd watching, no dramatic music announcing destiny. Just a decision, a terrifying decision, the kind that splits life into two versions, the life you leave behind and the life you cannot yet see. For Abraham, that moment began with a voice, or perhaps with something harder to explain. A calling, a deep certainty, a feeling impossible to prove, yet impossible to ignore. The ancient story says Abram was living in familiarity, a settled life, a known world, a city filled with structure, family nearby, traditions surrounding him, everything predictable, everything understandable. And then came the impossible instruction: leave. Leave your country, leave your people, leave your father's house, go to a land that will be shown to you later, not now. Later, imagine hearing that. No map, no destination, no timeline, no certainty, only trust, only mystery, only a promise. most people would hesitate. Most people would ask questions. Where exactly am I going? How long will it take? What if this fails? What if I lose everything? But somehow, Abram moved. And perhaps that alone makes him extraordinary. Because history rarely changes through people who wait until fear disappears. History changes through people willing to walk, while fear still speaks. Imagine the first morning. The city behind him, familiar streets fading slowly, dust rising beneath tired feet, family gathering belongings, animals moving restlessly, possessions packed, the sounds of ordinary life growing quieter in the distance. Everything familiar, slowly disappearing, and somewhere deep inside, a terrifying realization. There is no going back. Because leaving changes people. The moment you walk away, certainty disappears. And suddenly, faith becomes real. Not religious faith only, human faith. The kind every person eventually needs. Faith in tomorrow. Faith in possibility. Faith that sacrifice means something. Abram began walking. Across lands he did not know. Toward a future he could not imagine. Through open plains, rocky roads, harsh climates, uncertain territories. Imagine the exhaustion. Days stretching endlessly. Heat pressing against skin. Nights filled with unfamiliar silence. Danger never far away. Travel in the ancient world was brutal. Bandits, famine, war, wild terrain, unpredictable rulers. Death could arrive without warning, and still, Abram walked. Why? Because somewhere inside him, something stronger than fear remained. Hope, or perhaps belief. Belief that life held something larger than what already existed? And maybe that feeling feels familiar, because every human being eventually faces invisible promises, a dream no one else understands, a purpose impossible to explain, a risk others question, something inside quietly whispering, keep moving, even when logic hesitates, even when certainty refuses to arrive. And perhaps that is why Abraham's story still survives. Because at some point, everyone must decide, do stay where life feels safe, or risk everything for something greater. The journey continued. Town after town, camp after camp, unknown roads, unknown people, and eventually, according to the story, Abram arrived in Canaan, the promised land, or at least part of it. Imagine the moment. After all the walking, all the uncertainty, standing there, looking across unfamiliar land, wondering, this is where everything begins. Because promises rarely arrive the way people expect. The land was not empty. Other tribes already lived there. Challenges remained, conflict remained, uncertainty remained. The promise did not remove struggle. And perhaps that surprises many people, because modern culture teaches something dangerous. That purpose should feel easy, clear, certain. But Abraham's story suggests something different. Purpose often arrives with confusion. Faith often walks beside uncertainty. The right path often still feels frightening. And life did not suddenly become simple for Abram. Far from it. The story quickly becomes complicated. Famine struck. Survival became difficult. Fear returned. Abram traveled again, this time toward Egypt. And here, we meet something deeply human, because Abraham was not perfect, not fearless, not flawless. In Egypt, fear overtook him. He worried powerful rulers might kill him because of Sarah's beauty, so he made a troubling decision. He told others she was his sister, a decision born from fear, a decision historians and believers still debate. And perhaps this matters more than people realize, Because Abraham's story never pretends faith, removes weakness. Fear remained. Mistakes remained. Doubt remained. Even the father of faith struggled. And honestly, that feels strangely comforting. Because too often, people imagine spiritual figures as superhuman, perfect, unshakable. But Abraham feels human, complicated. Sometimes courageous, sometimes afraid, sometimes confident, sometimes uncertain. And perhaps that is exactly why his story resonates. Because courage is not perfection. Courage means continuing despite imperfection. The years passed. And then came another challenge, a painful one. The promise remained invisible. No child arrived. No future visible. Only time passing. Imagine the frustration. Imagine the questions. God had promised descendants. Yet Abram grew older. Sarah grew older. Hope slowly became difficult. Perhaps some nights Abram stared at the stars, asking painful questions. Did I misunderstand? Was I wrong to leave everything? What if the promise was never real? Because delayed hope hurts, especially when sacrifice feels expensive. And maybe many people understand that feeling, working toward dreams that take longer than expected, waiting for healing, waiting for success, waiting for meaning, waiting for life to make sense, and still moving forward. The ancient story tells us something beautiful happened one night. God brought Abram outside, into darkness, under the sky, and spoke words that still echo through history. Look up at the heavens. Count the stars if you can. So shall your descendants be. Imagine that moment. An old man, childless, standing beneath endless stars, hearing impossible hope, and somehow believing, not because proof existed, but despite proof missing. Perhaps that was Abraham's real miracle, not fatherhood, not blessing, belief itself. Because hope is difficult, especially delayed hope. Yet somehow, Abram kept walking. Years passed, still no child, still uncertainty, still waiting. And then the impossible happened. Against age, against expectation, against biology itself. Sarah became pregnant. Shishak was born. Laughter after sorrow, hope after disappointment, life after waiting. And suddenly, the impossible promise no longer felt invisible. But Abraham's story was never mainly about land, or descendants, or even blessing. At its heart, it was about trust, the terrifying kind, the kind requiring movement before answers arrive, the kind demanding courage before certainty appears. And maybe that is why billions still remember him. Because Abraham represents something deeply human. The courage to walk toward something unseen. The willingness to trust meaning before evidence fully arrives. The painful beauty of becoming someone new by leaving something old behind. And perhaps that is the hardest journey any human being ever makes. Because sometimes life quietly asks, will you remain who you have always been, or risk becoming who you are meant to become? Abraham answered that question with footsteps, one uncertain day at a time, one frightening decision after another, one invisible promise, guiding him into history. And perhaps that is why the journey still matters. Because somewhere, someone listening right now may also stand at the edge of uncertainty, wondering whether to stay or walk. And now, we arrive at one of the oldest and most controversial questions in biblical history. Did Abraham really exist? Was Abraham truly a historical man, walking across deserts thousands of years ago? A tribal leader remembered through generations? A father of nations? Or was Abraham something else entirely? a symbolic ancestor, a theological figure, a sacred story created to explain identity. The truth is, this question has divided historians, archaeologists, believers, and skeptics for generations. Because unlike kings who left monuments, or emperors whose names were carved into stone, Abraham left something more fragile: memory. And memory, especially ancient memory, is difficult to measure. There is no royal palace bearing Abraham's name. No tomb historians agree belongs to him. No ancient inscription saying, "Abraham was here." No surviving document from neighboring kingdoms confirming his existence. And for some people, that ends the discussion. No evidence means no history. No proof means mythology. Simple. But history is rarely simple, especially ancient history. Because the deeper historians study the ancient world, the more uncomfortable certainty becomes. You see, many people imagine archaeology as something dramatic: a buried city uncovered, and inscription discovered, mystery solved. But real history rarely works that way, especially when discussing ordinary people. Because Abraham, if he existed, was not a king, not an emperor, not a ruler commanding armies. He was, according to the story, a wandering man, a tribal figure, a nomadic leader moving between lands. And ancient nomads rarely leave evidence behind. Think about it. Empires leave ruins. Nomads leave footprints, and footprints disappear, especially after thousands of years. Imagine trying to prove one ordinary traveler existed 4,000 years ago. A man without a palace, without monuments, without armies, without written records carrying his name. Suddenly, the absence of evidence feels less surprising. Still, historians continue searching. And interestingly, Abraham's story contains details that feel surprisingly authentic to the ancient Near East. Customs, family structures, legal practices, migration patterns, social relationships. Many details fit the historical world surprisingly well. For example, the biblical narrative describes tribal movements through regions that make historical sense. The tensions between herders and settled communities, historically believable. Marriage customs, remarkably consistent with ancient legal traditions. Inheritance conflicts, matching patterns known from the ancient world. And suddenly, the story feels grounded, not necessarily proven, but believable. Some historians argue this matters greatly, because fabricated stories often contain historical mistakes. Yet Abraham's narrative repeatedly reflects ancient realities, enough to make some scholars pause, enough to suggest perhaps memory survived, perhaps oral tradition preserved fragments of something real, and maybe, somewhere inside centuries of storytelling, a historical man still exists. But not everyone agrees. In fact, many scholars remain deeply skeptical. Their argument goes something like this: the Abraham stories were written down much later, long after the time Abraham supposedly lived, perhaps centuries later, meaning the writers may have shaped the story for theological reasons. 2. Explain origins, identity, purpose, a shared ancestor. After all, many ancient cultures created founding figures, heroes symbolizing national identity. Could Abraham have become something similar? A symbolic father for a people seeking meaning. This theory suggests Abraham may not be one historical man, but a collective memory, a symbolic ancestor representing generations of migration, one figure carrying the identity of many. And honestly, that idea is fascinating too, because history often transforms individuals into symbols. Real people become larger than life. Memory smooths complexity. Stories grow. Details become sacred. Meaning becomes more important than biography. Perhaps Abraham began as a real person, and over centuries became something larger. Or perhaps he was always symbolic, a narrative expressing deeper truths about identity, trust, and belonging. Still, there are clues historians find difficult to ignore. Consider the names: Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob. Many resemble naming patterns from the ancient Near East. Linguistically plausible, historically possible. Then there is geography. The biblical journey moves through real places, real trade routes, real political regions. Not fantasy kingdoms, not mythical worlds, historical landscapes. Mesopotamia, Canaan, Egypt, places ancient people genuinely moved between. Again, not proof, but plausibility. And in ancient history, plausibility matters, especially when certainty is impossible. Then there is another uncomfortable truth historians rarely admit openly. Ancient history contains enormous gaps, far more than most people realize. Entire civilizations vanished. Countless people disappeared from memory. Many historical figures exist with surprisingly little evidence, especially outside royal power. So, asking for modern standards of proof may sometimes misunderstand the ancient world. Still, we must remain honest. No archaeologist can currently say, "We found Abraham." No discovery has ended debate. And perhaps it never will. But maybe the deeper question matters more. Because perhaps Abraham's importance does not depend entirely on whether historians prove every detail. Think about his influence. Judaism traces spiritual ancestry to him. Christianity honors him. Islam reveres him. Billions of people know his name. 3 major world religions, all connected to one ancient figure. That alone makes Abraham historically important. Whether literal, symbolic, or somewhere in between, few individuals in history shaped civilizations so deeply. His ideas influenced morality, identity, faith, law, community, meaning. Civilizations rose, shaped by stories connected to him. And perhaps that influence itself becomes historical evidence of another kind. Not evidence of bones, but evidence of impact. Because history remembers people differently. Some leave monuments, others leave movements. Some leave kingdoms, others leave ideas. Abraham, if nothing else, left a story powerful enough to survive thousands of years. And stories do not survive that long without touching something deeply human. Still, allow me to share something personal. Not certainty, only perspective. If you ask me, did Abraham really exist? My honest answer is this. I believe he probably did. Not necessarily exactly as later generations described him. Not necessarily in every detail, but somewhere behind the tradition. I suspect there was a real person, a tribal leader, a migrant, a father, someone remembered because something about him felt extraordinary. Perhaps his faith, perhaps his leadership, perhaps his willingness to leave. And over generations, memory grew, stories expanded, meaning deepened, until Abraham became larger than history itself. And honestly, that feels deeply human, because human beings remember people who change direction, people who risk comfort, people who leave certainty behind. And Abraham, whether historical or symbolic, represents something timeless: the courage to trust uncertainty, the willingness to move before answers arrive, the terrifying beauty of beginning again. Perhaps that is why the question of Abraham never disappears. Because whether he existed or not, his story forces something deeply uncomfortable into the open. What happens when someone chooses meaning over comfort? Because if Abraham truly existed, he changed history through faith. And if Abraham never existed, Then humanity still invented him for a reason. Either way, the story reveals something profound about what human beings long for. Purpose, direction, meaning, hope, a reason to walk forward, even when the road remains invisible. And maybe that is why Abraham still matters. Because long after debates fade, long after historians continue arguing, one question remains painfully relevant. What kind of person walks away from certainty for a promise no one else can see? Now, let us step away from Abraham for a moment. Forget the deserts. Forget the tents. Forget the ancient world. And ask a question that feels far more personal. What are we willing to leave behind for meaning? Because perhaps that is why Abraham's story survived. Not because modern people understand ancient migration, not because we fully understand the historical debates, but because deep down, something in Abraham feels painfully familiar. A crossroads, a choice, the terrifying moment when life quietly asks, will you stay where it feels safe, or leave for something uncertain? And if we are honest, every human being eventually faces that question. Maybe not through deserts, maybe not through ancient promises, but in quieter ways. Modern life gives us our own versions of Abraham's journey. A career that no longer feels meaningful, a relationship that quietly stopped growing, a city that no longer feels like home, a dream that scares us because it matters too much, a future impossible to explain to other people. And, perhaps, that is where Abraham suddenly stops feeling ancient, because many people today are standing exactly where he once stood, between comfort and calling. And honestly, comfort is seductive. Comfort feels safe, predictable, controlled. You know what tomorrow looks like? You know who you are. You know the rules. And there is nothing wrong with safety, until safety quietly becomes stagnation. Because perhaps one of the most dangerous things in life is this: a comfortable life that slowly disconnects us from meaning. You wake up, go to work, pay bills, repeat routines, move through days that feel increasingly familiar. Weeks blur into months, months into years, and somewhere, a quiet question begins forming. Is this really my life? Maybe some people listening understand that feeling. Life looks successful from the outside, stable, safe, predictable. Yet something inside feels restless, unfulfilled, like a deeper part of you has quietly fallen asleep. And maybe that feeling matters more than we realize, because perhaps that quiet discomfort is what Abraham felt too. Something whispering, there is more than this. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Meaning usually costs something. And modern culture rarely talks honestly about cost. We are told success should feel easy, fast, efficient, certain. But history tells another story. Meaning almost always requires leaving something behind. Comfort, security, old identity, predictability. Sometimes even people. Abraham left home. Others leave careers. Some leave toxic environments. Some leave old versions of themselves. And perhaps that is the hidden struggle modern people rarely discuss. Growth often feels like grief, because every meaningful transformation includes loss. The old self dies. Old habits disappear. Old certainties collapse. And for a while, life feels uncertain, messy, unclear, just like Abraham's journey. Imagine how terrifying that must have felt, walking toward a promise he could not see, no guarantee, no timeline, no proof, only movement. And honestly, modern people struggle deeply with uncertainty. We want plans, timelines, results. We ask questions like, how long will this take? Will it definitely work? Can I guarantee success first? But life rarely works that way. Some of the most meaningful decisions happen without certainty. Marriage, parenthood, starting over, changing careers, forgiveness, healing, faith. You never fully know what comes next. You move and discover the road while walking. And maybe that is why Abraham still matters, because he represents something modern people desperately struggle with: trusting the invisible, not blind optimism, not fantasy, but courageous uncertainty. The willingness to believe life may hold meaning, even before evidence appears. And perhaps our generation struggles with this more than most, because modern life teaches us to trust only what we can measure: numbers, data, proof, results, visibility. If something cannot be quantified, many people dismiss it. But some of life's most important things resist measurement: love, meaning, purpose, healing, trust, hope. None of these arrive with guarantees. And yet, human beings still build lives around them. Because deep down, people know something important: a meaningful life requires risk. Still, there is another modern parallel hidden inside Abraham's story: identity. Because leaving changes identity. When Abraham left home, he stopped being simply a man of Ur. He became someone new. But transformation is uncomfortable. Modern people understand this too. Think about how hard change feels: leaving old habits, changing environments, starting over, choosing healthier relationships, healing from pain, building discipline, creating boundaries. Every transformation asks something painful. Are you willing to stop being who you have always been? And honestly, many people stay stuck because familiarity feels safer than growth, even painful familiarity. At least it is known. At least it feels predictable. The unknown feels terrifying. But Abraham's story quietly reminds us, you cannot become someone new while refusing to leave what keeps you small. And perhaps that lesson matters deeply today, because many people feel trapped in routines, trapped in fear, trapped in expectations, trapped in lives that no longer feel meaningful. And maybe, somewhere inside, they quietly wonder, what if I started over? What if I finally listened to that deeper voice? What if life really could become different? But fear answers quickly. What if you fail? What if people judge you? What if you lose everything? And maybe that fear sounds familiar too, because Abraham likely wrestled with those same questions. Real courage does not remove fear. It simply refuses to obey fear completely. Then there is another uncomfortable truth. Modern society often confuses success with meaning. People chase money, status, recognition, titles, influence, and none of those things are inherently wrong. But eventually, many people reach a painful realization. Success without meaning still feels empty. A bigger house cannot fix emptiness. Recognition cannot silence inner restlessness. Achievement cannot replace purpose. And perhaps that is another reason Abraham still matters. Because he walked away from visible success toward invisible meaning. Think about that. He traded certainty for purpose. And honestly, modern culture rarely celebrates that. People celebrate outcomes, not uncertainty. People celebrate arrival, not sacrifice. Yet every meaningful life story contains sacrifice somewhere. Athletes sacrifice comfort. Artists sacrifice certainty. Parents sacrifice sleep. Entrepreneurs sacrifice stability. Healers sacrifice old pain. Growth costs something, always. And maybe that is the question Abraham quietly asks every generation. What matters enough to risk comfort? Because comfort alone rarely creates transformation. History changes through people willing to walk uncertain roads. And perhaps that includes ordinary people too. Not kings, not heroes, not famous leaders, just ordinary people brave enough to listen when life whispers. There is more. Still, before we romanticize uncertainty too much, there is something important to remember. Abraham's journey was not instant success. He struggled, failed, doubted, waited. Faith did not remove hardship. Purpose did not remove confusion. Meaning did not remove pain. And honestly, that feels deeply real. Because growth often looks messy before it looks beautiful. Many people quit too early because they expect certainty too quickly. But Abraham reminds us, sometimes meaning unfolds slowly, one uncertain step at a time, one difficult season at a time, one frightening decision after another. And perhaps that is the modern challenge. Not whether we admire Abraham, but whether we would live like him. Would we leave what no longer serves us? Would we risk comfort for meaning? Would we trust something deeper before evidence fully arrives? Or would we stay where life feels predictable, even if part of us quietly knows we are meant for more? Because perhaps that is why Abraham still survives after thousands of years. Not because he crossed deserts, but because every human being eventually stands at a crossroads. And life quietly asks, will you remain where you are comfortable, or become who you are capable of becoming? And perhaps the hardest journey anyone ever takes is not across land, but away from the life that no longer feels true. And so, after deserts, after waiting, after promises, after uncertainty, we arrive at the end of Abraham's journey. Or perhaps not the end, because some stories never truly end. Some stories continue living inside every generation that still wrestles with the same questions. And perhaps that is why Abraham survived history. Because whether you see him as a real man, a sacred figure, a symbol, something in between, his story touches something deeply human. Fear, hope, waiting, purpose, loss, faith, and perhaps above all, the terrifying uncertainty of becoming someone new. Because Abraham's story begins where many human struggles begin, with a decision, a frightening decision, to leave. And maybe that is the first lesson humanity still struggles to accept. Lesson 1. Growth almost always requires leaving something behind. Abraham could not begin a new journey while remaining exactly where he was. He had to leave. Home, comfort, predictability, familiar identity. And honestly, this feels deeply uncomfortable. Because human beings love certainty. We stay where life feels familiar. Even when familiar no longer feels fulfilling. Even when routines quietly drain us. Even when part of us knows something needs to change. But change costs something. Growth costs something. Healing costs something. Meaning costs something. You cannot become stronger without leaving weakness behind. You cannot become healthier without leaving destructive habits behind. You cannot become wiser without leaving old assumptions behind. And perhaps that is why many people remain stuck. Not because they lack dreams, but because they fear loss. Yet Abraham's story quietly asks, what if staying costs more than leaving? That is an uncomfortable question. Because sometimes the safest life becomes the smallest life. And perhaps the greatest risk is not failure. Perhaps the greatest risk is never truly becoming who we are capable of becoming. But Abraham teaches another difficult truth too. Because his story was never quick, never easy, never immediate. Lesson 2. Faith means moving before you fully understand. Modern people love certainty. plans, roadmaps, proof, guarantees. We ask questions like, how long will this take? Will this definitely work? Can I know the outcome first? But Abraham's story offers something deeply frustrating and deeply honest. Life rarely provides certainty first. Meaning often requires movement before clarity arrives. Abraham did not receive the full picture. He received direction, a step, and then another. And perhaps that is what real faith actually looks like. Not blind belief, not pretending fear disappears. Faith means moving while uncertainty still exists. Trusting without controlling every outcome. Walking while still asking questions. And honestly, that is terrifying, because uncertainty makes people uncomfortable. Yet some of the most meaningful parts of life demand exactly that. Love, marriage, forgiveness, healing, purpose, parenthood, new beginnings. No one receives guarantees. You move and slowly discover who you are becoming. And perhaps many people listening need that reminder. You do not need every answer before beginning. Sometimes, clarity arrives after courage, not before it. But Abraham teaches something else too, something deeply painful, because waiting shaped much of his life. Lesson 3. Delayed hope is still hope. Perhaps one of the hardest parts of Abraham's story was waiting. Waiting for promises that seemed impossible. Waiting while reality looked disappointing. Waiting while time passed. Waiting while hope grew difficult. And honestly, many people understand waiting. Waiting for healing. Waiting for breakthrough. Waiting for purpose. Waiting for love. Waiting for peace. Waiting for life to finally make sense. And the painful truth is, waiting changes people. Sometimes it strengthens us. Sometimes it exhausts us. Sometimes it tempts us to quit. Abraham likely knew that feeling too, wondering, did I misunderstand? Was I wrong? Will anything ever change? And yet, somehow, he kept walking. And perhaps that is one of the deepest lessons of all. Not all meaningful things happen quickly. Some things grow slowly, quietly, painfully. Healing takes time. Character takes time. Wisdom takes time. Trust takes time. And maybe the hardest part of faith is not beginning. Maybe the hardest part is continuing, especially when results feel invisible. But Abraham reminds us, delayed hope is not destroyed hope. And perhaps some people listening need to hear that today. Then there is another uncomfortable truth hidden in Abraham's story. One modern culture often avoids. Lesson 4. Purpose often feels lonely. Imagine Abraham leaving home again. Neighbors confused. Family uncertain. Others doubting him. No applause. No public celebration. Only questions. Because meaningful journeys often begin in loneliness. People may not understand your dream, your healing, your growth, your boundaries, your new direction. And honestly, that hurts. Human beings want approval, belonging, validation. Yet sometimes, growth requires walking roads other people cannot yet understand. Not because they are a bad people, but because they cannot see what you see. And perhaps that is one reason Abraham matters. He reminds us, you do not need universal understanding to pursue meaningful change. Sometimes, purpose asks you to walk while others still question you. And history repeatedly proves something beautiful. Many meaningful things begin misunderstood, but Abraham's story leaves behind another warning too. Lesson 5. Success without purpose eventually feels empty. Remember, Abraham walked away from visible security, not because security was evil, but because something deeper called him. And perhaps that matters deeply today, because modern culture constantly asks, How successful are you? But perhaps the better question is, how meaningful is your life becoming? Success without meaning often becomes exhaustion. Money without peace still feels restless. Recognition without purpose still feels lonely. Achievement without alignment still feels empty. Many people climb mountains only to discover they climbed the wrong one. And perhaps that is one reason Abraham still survives. Because he chose meaning over comfort, purpose over predictability, the invisible over the obvious. And honestly, that choice still feels radical today. Then there is one final lesson, perhaps the hardest one of all. Lesson 6. The most important journeys begin before you feel ready. If Abraham waited until certainty arrived, he never would have left. If Abraham waited until fear disappeared, he never would have moved. If Abraham waited until every question was answered, history might never remember his name. And perhaps that lesson matters deeply today. Many people delay their lives waiting to feel ready, waiting for confidence, waiting for certainty, waiting for permission, waiting for fear to disappear. But life rarely works that way. Sometimes the journey begins while your hands still shake. Sometimes the answer appears after the first step. Sometimes meaning grows while walking, not before. And perhaps that is Abraham's greatest lesson. Not perfect faith, not certainty, movement. The courage to begin, the courage to leave, the courage to trust something deeper, even when the future remains invisible. And now, after thousands of years, his story leaves us with one final question. Not whether Abraham was perfect, not whether every historical detail can be proven, but something far more personal, something uncomfortable, something honest. Because, eventually, life asks every human being, what are you willing to risk? For the life you quietly believe you were meant to live, will you stay where comfort feels safe? Or, like Abraham, will you walk towards something uncertain? Because something inside you knows, remaining where you are may no longer be enough. Because perhaps the greatest tragedy is not failing. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is ignoring the quiet calling that could have changed your life. And maybe that is why Abraham's story still survives. Not because he walked across deserts, but because somewhere deep inside, every human being wonders, what if the life I truly need exists on the other side of courage?